The University of Winnipeg is located on Treaty 1 territory, the national homeland of the Red River Métis in Winnipeck, Manitoba. We acknowledge that these are the ancestral lands of the Anishinaabe, Inis Innu, the Ininewak, Nahotawak, Ochete Sakoan, Dakota, Oyate, and Michif Métis peoples. UWinnipeg has to do a better job of confronting colonialism, and UWinnipeg has to do a better job of supporting Indigenous resurgence. Thanks to the UWinnipeg event and media team for working on this CAGE and Data Justice Hub webinar. Thanks to our audience and panel members for being here. Here's the format. We have 80 minutes or 90 minutes. We have our featured speakers, and we have a little bit of an overview of a new book that's coming out. If you're in the audience, you can pop questions into the chat and the Q&A tab, and we can see them, and our featured speakers will be happy to address those. So the title of the webinar, Data Activism in the Age of Trump 2.0. We have some featured speakers who we'll hear from in just a minute. Erin McElroy, Department of Geography, University of Washington, and co-founder of the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project. Jacinta Gonzalez, Head of Programs, MediaJustice. Munira Lokhandwala, Co-Executive Director, LittleSis, the Public Accountability Initiative. And Petra Molnar, Refugee Law Lab, Center for Refugee Studies, York University. We're really lucky to have these folks here, and it's part of a book launch for a book called Mobilizing Data for Justice from the Data Justice Hub. That's Elena, Chris, myself, Marios, Sarah. We're going to say just a little bit about the project in the book before our featured speakers kind of take over and share a little bit about what they're working on. The Data Justice Hub, it's a project that we started working on as a group a few years ago. Over the course of the research we've been doing, we've talked to over 50 activists around the world involved in social struggles that intersect with data justice in different ways. We wanted to learn from them as sort of like on-the-ground practitioners of data activism about what challenges there are in doing this work, what strategies are effective in addressing those. And the feature speakers you're going to hear from today are all folks we talked with for the book. The aim of the Data Justice Hub more broadly is to provide a venue where we can have conversations about data, justice, and activism. We've put together a resource page, podcast series, and some workshops featuring the work of data justice activists around the world. And then we decided to put together this book, which Chris and Elena are going to talk about a little bit before our guest speakers take over with their remarks. So over to you, Elena and Chris.
Thank you, Kevin. Hi, everyone. I'm Elena Rowan. I'm a part of the Data Justice Hub and co-author on the book, as Kevin said. And I'm going to share a bit about the book that we wrote. It shares insights from the interviews and our research on how activists are engaging with data in new and unique ways to further their causes. So it's organized loosely into five chapters, loosely based on the themes we identified in the research. The first is about assembling communities of practice and caring capacity building in data activism. The second is about negotiating surveillance infrastructures and the dual praxis of watching and evading. The third is about accessing data and access to information as data activism. The fourth is about archiving data and working between the open data and data sovereignty. And the final chapter is about visualizing data and going from debunking to visceralization. And we conclude by reaffirming the need to move towards data justice. Each chapter focuses on strategies and tips that can be employed in social justice organizing by anyone. And we hope people check out the book to learn more about the amazing groups we interviewed, the incredible work they are all doing, mobilizing data for justice. And if Chris wants to add anything, more than welcome to, please. And he's going to talk a bit more about the motivation for this event.
Yeah, great. So here's a copy of the book for you all to see. It's with Between the Lions Press. Check it out. I believe we have a discount code. If you just contact us after the event, we can send you a discount code for the book, which is 25% off. It's got pictures in it, which is lovely. And yeah, as Alida mentioned, it's really framed as a kind of a how-to guide, drawing from kind of best practices from people, different activists around the world. So check it out. And for the event, we were considering just talking about the book ourselves, but we thought a much better idea would actually be to hear from some of the activists that we spoke to for the book and for our project. And we wrote the book, I think it was around 2020 to 2024, right? And so a lot of stuff was happening then, obviously. But since we wrote the book, a lot of stuff has already changed quite a bit, politically with the rise of authoritarian governments around the world, economically with the consolidation of big tech companies, the growing connections of big tech with governments, and technologically with the rise of artificial intelligence. And so we thought we would use this book as this event as an opportunity to kind of reconnect with the people we've talked to and discuss how things are changing and what can be done about it. Again, our book was very much focused on strategy, so we want to talk about strategies here. And we have a great group of speakers. We have Erin McElroy, Associate Professor in the Department of Geography at University of Washington, where their work focuses on gentrification, technology, empire, fascism, and racial capitalism alongside housing justice, organizing, and transnational solidarities. Erin is the author of Silicon Valley Imperialism, Techno Fantasies and Frictions in Post-Socialist Times in 2024. Co-editor of Counterpoints, San Francisco Bay Area Atlas of Displacement and Resistance with the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project, which they're also a co-founder, and they run the Anti-Eviction Lab at U of W, University of Washington, where much of the student and community-led research focuses on landlord tech watch. Erin is currently working on a new book project entitled Techno-Feudal Fever Dreams, Fascistic Fiefdoms, Doom Loop Dystopics, and the Urban Anxieties of Empire, and is also co-curating a new Atlas project on political software. We have Jacinta Gonzalez from MediaJustice, also associated with No Tech for ICE, which has been focused on exposing the connections between the Trump regime and big tech, challenging the reach of the surveillance state. We have Munira Lokhandwala, the co-executive director of LittleSis. In her role, she focuses on the organization's mission to support grassroots organizers through power research trainings. A big part of what LittleSis does is power mapping, which we discuss in the book, which involves mapping out networks of affiliation, linking together political and economic elites in different areas. And we have Petra Molnar, who is the director of the Refugee Law Lab and author of The Walls Have Eyes, Surviving Migration in the Age of Artificial Intelligence, which was a finalist for the Governor General's Literary Award and CBC Book of the Year in 2024. So great group of speakers. In terms of format, we're going to give each of them a chance to speak for 10 to 15 minutes just about their work and some of the challenges that they've been facing over the past couple of years, as well as strategies and ways forward. And so we're going to have each of them present their work, and then we're going to open a space for Q&A and discussion afterwards. So save your questions for then. And we're going to get started with Erin. Erin, do you want to kick it off?
Sure. Yeah, well, thank you all so much for being here and for having me. And yeah, congratulations to Chris and Kevin, Alina, everybody who was part of making this book. It's having been part of creating a co-authored, co-edited book in the past. I know it's no easy feat. And yeah, it's really, really so exciting and so timely to come out now. So so I encourage everybody to read it. And yeah, and I think that this is really exciting to have this panel today as well, given how much things have changed since I know the kind of early days that the book was conceptualized and when we were all meeting and talking just a few years ago. And I guess maybe that's just something to talk about today, like what has changed, but also what are kind of the through lines and continuities. And that's something I can touch on a little bit. I think I've been, obviously horrified by everything happening in the US, but also globally in recent years, but also always recognize that this kind of is sitting on the bedrock of a long history of imperial and fascistic violence that also predates the present. And that's something that in some of my work I try to explore and foreground. But I think that there's so much that we can learn from prior organizing strategies and tactics. And also, there are so many ways that we need to also reconceptualize and re-strategize given some of the current challenges. So anyway, I guess just to kind of introduce myself and the projects that I'm a part of. The big one, I suppose, is the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project, which I co-founded in 2013 in San Francisco. It's a project that now has chapters in the San Francisco Bay Area, also New York City, Los Angeles. And we have a recently established chapter here in Seattle, where I currently am. And the goal of the project really from the beginning has been to create data, tools, software, but also stories and maps and other sort of visual modes of documentation and communication to support frontline tenant organizing in the wake of gentrification and racial banishment and dispossession in the different cities where we have chapters. We're like a volunteer-based collective, so most of what we do is just based on who shows up and does the work together. And it's been interesting. I mean, I think that so much of what we did in the early 2010s was responding to the foreclosure crisis and also what some people were calling the tech boom 2.0 or the second dot-com boom, but kind of a moment in which real estate and techno capital converged in sort of novel ways, but also ways that were also precedented by the dot-com boom and also just prior waves of colonial relationships to tech and real estate converging. And we can go back centuries to kind of look at these different histories. But in this particular moment in the 2010s in San Francisco, where I was a housing organizer at the time, there were just tons and tons of people being evicted as white-collar tech workers were moving to the region and real estate speculators were capitalizing upon that wealth and evicting longtime residents to make way for kind of a new wave of tech wealth. And we were doing a lot of organizing in the streets, blocking Google buses and Apple buses, Netflix buses, Facebook buses, basically these private luxury shuttles that were transporting newly arrived white-collar workers from San Francisco to Silicon Valley. And we were seeing waves of evictions kind of spark up where these bus stops would be laid. So we were also seeing a ton of people being evicted and not knowing who was evicting them. And this was this moment in which landlords and real estate speculators following the foreclosure crisis began to hide behind these waves of shell companies and LLCs and LPs. And so a lot of what we did in the part of the reason why the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project formed in the first place was one, to better uncover who the serial evictors were that were evicting tenants so that tenants could form tenant unions and mobilize across buildings that were buildings owned by similar landlords to create kind of tenant power and organize collectively, which is a lot more effective than organizing as a solo tenant, especially if that landlord owns tons of buildings and is evicting tons of people at the same time. And that data is really hard to obtain. There's no data set that the government gives out, that the city gives out of who the actual people are behind LLCs and LPs when it comes to real estate. Even if you can get some of that data, it doesn't map onto kind of the eviction information that we were able to get through record requests, or how property sales transactions take place, or building complaints filed in different buildings that indicate abusive real estate practices. So a lot of what we did early on and that we continue to do today is work to weave different data sets together. We have a tool called a Victor book that we've created that currently works in San Francisco and Oakland so that tenants can look up shell companies or look up addresses and figure out all of the other buildings that their landlord owns and who the humans are behind those investment companies. And that's really important if you're trying to organize direct actions against your landlord. And we continue to do that. Also, what we were trying to do early on was figure out, how do we understand the sort of geography of real estate and techno-capitalism converging? So, like, how do we understand that so many evictions are taking place in proximity to big tech infrastructure? And so we were doing some geospatial analysis at the time to better understand that, to push for different policies and also to organize direct actions and to change the narrative. And so, we continue to do that. We're actually now in the process of building out a Victor book in Seattle, slowly learning from some of what we did before. This time, we're really trying to be more intentional about using our own servers. And we did kind of fall into some of the traps of using corporate infrastructure before that we were really critical of it. And I think this is an ongoing challenge as big companies like AWS or Amazon monopolize so much of the digital infrastructure that we use, even when we're trying to retool or reappropriate or expropriate some of the big tech infrastructure. But we're constantly trying to push for that. And I think there's a lot more will to do that now, given the horrors that people are witnessing that these companies are responsible for. I'll say too that in 2019, I started this project called Landlord Tech Watch, which is now housed by a lab that I run at the University of Washington, but it also involves other community partners outside of the university. And so while in the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project, we were looking at kind of how big tech was inciting real estate capital and evictions. And this project, we're looking at actually the surveillance technologies that landlords and property managers are deploying in tenant housing in order to automate evictions and automate gentrification, much of which is currently using AI, is using facial recognition algorithms, using all sorts of technology that's extremely problematic. And actually, a lot of that work is based in New York City, which is kind of one of the epicenters of the landlord tech industry, or as the real estate industry calls it, the prop tech industry. And that's in part because New York City's long been the center of what Sam Stein calls the real estate state. And I think Trump and Kushner are really paradigmatic of that and kind of how big real estate has been in New York's kind of evolution. But there has also been a really long history of Israeli and U.S. Policing and surveillance converging in New York, particularly after 9/11. And so the very first facial recognition company that was deployed in low-income housing in New York City, and I think in the U.S., was actually deployed in Knickerbocker Village in the Lower East Side in 2013. And that was after a former Israeli general retired as somebody who was responsible for the destruction of thousands of homes and hundreds of deaths in Palestine. And he then decided as a retirement project to implement some of this technology in tenant housing in the US. And so there have been lots of fights against that, and we're actively continuing to produce public scholarship and popular educational materials around the harms associated with landlord tech. There's been a real shift with the Mamdani government in New York City, and so we actually are working with some people who are interested in curbing and trying to regulate some of this abuse, while at the same time, drawing connections between different contexts of U.S. empire and surveillance, and we're continuing to look at what it means to have a sort of anti-militarization, anti-genocidal politic in some of the housing organizing that we're doing and in the U.S. in cities like New York or San Francisco. And to that end, I'll say I'm also, I know it sounds like I'm part of all these projects, but there's a project called the Phoenix Project in San Francisco that I'm a part of. I'm on the board, and what we're doing in that project now is really trying to uncover how tech capital is influencing local politics in San Francisco and the sort of Silicon Valley broader economy. And I think it's really interesting to follow the money. I know that's what LittleSis does too, and Munira will talk more about that. But so much of what we're seeing happening in terms of U.S. empire right now is so linked to Silicon Valley and so linked to some of the companies complicit in local context of gentrification there, but also context of mass displacement and genocide and dispossession globally. And so in that project, we're really trying to understand how like astroturfing works, how these different kind of groups are forming that we saw actually begin to form in the early 2010s, some of which people thought were kind of a joke at the time. There was a group called the Bay Area Renters Federation, or SF-BARF, and they pretended to be a tenant group. And we just thought they were funny because they called themselves BARF. But now they've become this huge NIMBY network that is actually funneling all sorts of money towards local and state politics across the Bay Area and California and even nationally. And they're involving, people like Balaji Srinivasan and Gary Tan, who are pushing for bizarre policies like tech Zionism and things like that, and making it a lot harder to engage in tenant organizing in particular ways because of how much they're pushing also for kind of new carceral techno-solutionism right in the heart of San Francisco. So that's something that we're working on now too, in collaboration with many other groups. But I guess, I know I'm just rambling, but those are just some of the projects that I'm working on and some of the ways in which the work goes on. The contexts have shifted slightly, but I think it's more important than ever to do this work with an anti-fascist politic kind of front and center. Maybe that's good. I can leave it there. Does that seem good?
Yeah, that's great.
Okay.
Thanks, Erin. Yeah. Maybe we could move on to Jacinta. Do you want to speak next?
It's wonderful to be here. I'm Jacinta Gonzalez. I am an organizer, longtime organizer, both in the effort against policing, but also around stopping deportations. I have both doing a lot of work when I was a staff of Mi Gente, continued to be a proud member of the organization, even though now I work at an organization called MediaJustice. And so wanted to talk a little bit about both the work that I had been doing through Mi Gente with the No Tech for ICE campaign, and then how it connects to some of the fights and the organizing that's happening now in a broader space against data centers and against the infrastructure that the tech oligarchy is building out to be able to conduct the surveillance state that they have done. I am not a technologist in any way, shape, or form, as exhibited by my inability to share my screen. I come from this perspective of having organized against the Department of Homeland Security and ICE since the Bush years at this point. And so with each administration have sort of seen the ways that their enforcement activities have been shifting. And from the beginning, DHS has always had the mission and the vision of being able to surveil, identify, detain, and deport anyone who's undocumented in the United States. And initially, the way that they would sort of build up this infrastructure to be able to conduct that mission was really investing a lot of money into partnerships with local police departments. So this could be the 287G agreements, this could be secure communities agreements where they would share data back and forth by people's biometrics, people's fingerprints. And so part of the way that we organized against this was around being able to pass local policies, right? We would say our police department, our jail will not work with ICE, will not be part of this machinery. And we're able to sort of set up some protections for communities. Some places called them sanctuaries. Some people decided to use different ways of describing them. But this was part of the effort and the movement that we were seeing. And what we started to see, particularly under the Trump administration, is that the way ICE agents were operating in the field was shifting. And people were asking us questions time and time again. How do they know my address? How do they know who my family is? How do they know where I work? How do they know where I drive every day? And so we decided to do some research and put out a report that was part of an organizing effort already called No Tech for ICE, And this report was called Who's Behind ICE? The Tech and Data Companies Fueling Deportations. And we kind of were able to do corporate research and corporate mapping to kind of peel back the curtain and sort of be able to name directly who some of these companies that were working for ICE were, right? So data brokers like Thomson Reuters and LexisNexis that were buying our information in bulk and selling it to ICE. Companies like Palantir that were custom making software for ICE to be able to conduct their cruelty. Companies that have already been named, like AWS, right, that were providing the cloud storage and the infrastructure for all of this to be able to run. So it was important for us to kind of be able to talk about it directly. And a little bit of like the way that we were thinking about this was sort of, I would say, like a traditional profiteering framework, right, of like all of these big tech bros. They know that they can't make so much profit over some of the surveillance tech on their own. They actually have to have these contracts with the government to be able to expand the surveillance state as much as they want. And we thought they just thought of it as a cash cow. I think what we're seeing now, sort of almost 10 years after that report, is actually much more sinister. And we're now not only just asking ourselves the question of who are the tech companies behind ICE, but actually, what is the political agenda that ICE is behind? And realizing that a lot of these tech bros, a lot of these surveillance companies that were set up by the tech oligarchs also have a very deeply anti-democratic sentiment and are heavily invested in ensuring that we have a militarized police force that is at the disposal of whoever is in the executive office and can conduct that agenda, right? And so that agenda right now is clearly anti-immigrant. We've seen it with all of the violence that we've seen in the streets time and time again, whether you go to LA or Chicago or Minneapolis or rural Georgia. You will see examples of ICE's violence and repression, but we see that agenda start to be opened up more and more to, what we can say in shorthand is anti-American sentiment, but really anyone who voices any sort of pushback against this administration, any defense of the planet, any defense of civil rights, civil liberties, or human rights is immediately criminalized with a police force that counts on the surveillance tech created by the tech oligarchy. And so I think for us, we're thinking about how do we put out another version of the report that actually describes everything that we're seeing, but also really describes for communities directly what is the tech that we're seeing on the ground, right? Palantir is still custom making software for ICE, but now they also have contracts with the IRS and Health and Human Services. They have over $10 billion of contracts with the federal government and are really trying to make themselves indispensable to the creation of the federal government because that is part of their way of conducting this agenda of capture and control. And so I think for us, it's about thinking, how are we expanding? A lot of the technology that ICE has now also allows them to hack your phone, to be able to not only see where you're driving, but also hack into your car and be able to control it, right? They're using more drones in their operations. And so time and time again, we've seen immigrants and criminalized communities be at the forefront of this violence, but understanding that really it's just the way where they're starting to build up that mechanism. And I think what we're seeing and what is just so alarming about this moment is that they not only have the political control, but now they also just have the money, right? And so bills like the big bad bill, the amount of billions of dollars that now DHS has at its disposal it is actually very hard to imagine, right, what they're going to do with all of these billions of dollars. And so that's what the graph that I was trying to show. If for decades, advocates, organizers, activists have been talking about how much money we're investing in war, in surveillance, and policing, you can see dramatically the numbers where quite literally everything that was being cut by DOGE at the beginning of the government didn't make the government smaller, it just reinforced and reinvested it into policing and militarization. And you see quite very clearly, things that we've been saying for a while just start to dramatically get even more intense with repercussions for generations to come. So I think for us, the organizing and the work that we have in front of us right now is being able to, one, do the corporate mapping, talk about the surveillance in ways that people can understand, right? It is both horrible and scary and menacing, but it's even more when you think about it as like this huge beast that's like mythical and you can't actually take on. Like we can actually talk concretely about who are the companies, what are the technologies, how can people protect themselves, but also create communities that can be in resistance not only against the violent policies of an agency like ICE, but also take on the corporate interests and corporate money that is colluding so deeply with them, because we need a movement that can both be able to advocate for that policy, advocate for a different vision of government, but also exercise our muscle in terms of holding corporations accountable as well in their interest in what they're trying to build out. So for us, again, that's doing the research, that's doing the organizing work, working with directly impacted communities, but also doing the advocacy, doing the organizing. That means protesting, that means working with investors, that means passing policies, that means taking on litigation, that means students organizing on campus, that means nurses organizing in hospitals, that means immigrant rights organizers. Like there really is sort of a bigger space for all of us. We just came out of conducting a convening in Atlanta, Georgia called Take Back Tech. And we had over 450 people from different movements come together to talk about how tech and surveillance and the tech oligarchy is impacting their work, their movements, their vision of the world. And so I think that's where, for us, we want to continue to invest, because part of the reason why this is a real fight is we have real things to defend. I want to keep grounded in that work.
Great, thanks. Munira, do you want to go next?
Hey everyone, thanks so much for having LittleSis on this webinar and for including us in the book, which is really incredible. And I've really enjoyed actually getting to read all the different case studies that you have in the book. So I really encourage others to do that as well. So just to introduce myself, my name is Munira Lokhandwala. I'm the co-ED of LittleSis, a researcher. I come from a labor organizing and research background, and I've been with LittleSis now for over 8 years. And just to share a little bit about what LittleSis is, we are a watchdog research organization. We focus on corporate and government accountability in our research and our reporting. We do what's known as power research, which is a kind of investigative research that aims to understand how power operates in our society by investigating like the various pillars that uphold powerful institutions that are shaping kind of our economy and our policymaking. We do this by uncovering networks of corporations, millionaires and billionaires, shedding light on how they're using their money to influence and shape policymaking for their interests, which is primarily profit-driven. We are an organization that does research, but we also train others in doing research, since there is no shortage in the work. We're a small organization. We have 6 full-time staff, so we focus a lot of our capacity, especially in recent years, on our training program, which is aimed at teaching people how to access and use publicly available information and data for their organizing, for their campaigns, and for the long haul work of holding corporations accountable. So we think that teaching people to use these tools is, first and foremost skill building, but also an entry into deepening our collective understanding of how power works and how to really challenge it. So widening our network of watchdogs and researchers. And we often say that in our work, politicians come and go, but corporations are here to stay, or they're trying to stay, and our work is to challenge that. And so we really try to help people, develop long haul corporate campaigns to kind of win what's needed for us to thrive. So since 2008, we've also been maintaining a database called LittleSis.org, which is, the name comes from the opposite of Big Brother. And it's a little nod to counter surveillance. And the database allows people to both find information about corporations and networks of power, but also to add their own research into kind of a shared research platform, so that others can see the research that they've added, engage with it, add to it. And then we also built a power network mapping tool called Oligrapher. The name is like oligarchy plus graphing, so mapping power. And it's to help take the research and create a way to visually represent the kind of interconnectedness between capital and decision making, and and really show the ties between the private sector and government. And this is our attempt, I think building this database and the mapping tool are ways for us also to like unsilo this work of corporate accountability research and making it, and also to make it digestible to those who aren't trained in the field of doing corporate research, and are actually doing the work of kind of organizing in their communities. And to us, it's also a way of demystifying power and what it is. To speak to what one of the earlier speakers said, we need to we can break it down, and we can start to understand how to create wedges that really challenge, and their pillars of support, so that we can build campaigns that can win. The database is a open source wiki style tool that we built, with organizers and activists and journalists in mind. And it's a way, to use to share information about key entities that they're investigating both nationally and locally. It was first launched in 2008 and has over 1 million entities that users have added over the years, and over 2 million connections between those entities. And since 2008, we've had over 600,000 people sign up to engage with the database in some fashion, whether as editors or just to come and find kind of research. The information in the database has to be publicly available, has to be cited using publicly available sources. So the database kind of has a built-in ethos that publicly available information can and should be shared and aggregated so that it can be actually useful to the public to hold power to account. Especially when understanding the relationship between kind of power, money, and like who's influencing the decision-making that's happening. So that's a little bit about kind of the work that we do. And I think to some of these questions about how the current context is shaping our work, I think, with the acceleration of kind of social media algorithms and over the last several years, we've really seen a rise in like siloing of information, echo chambers, and really a breakdown of any kind of like shared reality, that can have an impact on accountability work. So, using data to illustrate facts is no longer impactful in the ways that it once was. And, or to expose conflicts of interest is not enough to affect any kind of, action in this moment. And, especially any kind of action that we need to help change the course of things. Of course, media and journalism organizations in the US are becoming more worried about attacks on their ability to do their work under the current administration. And we're seeing major lawsuits, libel cases, and other tactics used by billionaires, politicians in the administration to silence and disarm organizations doing accountability work. So the fear around security, there's a lot of fear kind of in this realm in doing any kind of reporting. And we're feeling that both, from some of our journalism and media partners that we've worked with historically, and then other organizations like ours that do research work are also feeling that threat. And then we're also feeling it on the level of the foundations that fund us, who are worried about being connected to work that is challenging the current administration. So we've seen increased legal threats coming from individuals who are in our database, in some cases, multimillionaires and billionaires who want information about them sort of wiped from public databases. And are kind of threatening legal action. And of course, we work with First Amendment lawyers to kind of assess those threats. But it's definitely it feels like a kind of new era of people with those kinds of resources using legal threats to try to silence the work of our movement. So that's something I think a lot of us are thinking about. And I want to say at the same time, we're also seeing a growing consensus around the kind of like undue influence and power that billionaires hold in our society. I think we're really seeing more campaigns that are bringing billionaire power and influence into focus. And that's, I think, been a really kind of refreshing thing to see, especially as an organization that's been doing work around billionaire power for a really long time, to see that there's more of a mainstreaming of that sort of analysis that, of how they're using their power and influence to suppress kind of workers and just, try to create an environment for them to flourish and for the rest of us to suffer. And so it's been really, I think, great to see that. I wanted to bring some examples of things that we're feeling happy to see or that are kind of hopeful. I think also on the bright side, we're seeing a lot more interest in research in general as a skill that people want to develop to build their base and to support their campaigns. So in the last few years, we've been hosting public webinars year-round on learning how to, do research in different issue areas, from researching ICE contracts to the kind of power networks behind data center build-outs and war profiteering. And we're seeing every year more and more people joining these webinar trainings. We're also just getting an overwhelming number of requests from different groups that are organizing locally to help train them up in research skills. So that's a really heartening thing to see for us as an organization, that, in this moment where a lot of people are feeling a lot of fear and the kind of pressure, there's actually been even more sort of urgency to develop campaigns to push back against that. And in recent years, with the student movement developing divestment campaigns in support of Palestinian liberation, we also are seeing our movements kind of narrowing focus and exposing how a small set of corporations and financial institutions are at the center of profit making, whether it's extracting resource extraction and kind of environmental degradation, or like expanding kind of military and surveillance and war making. The poly crisis, as some of us are calling it, is actually in some instances helping us to see how our different issue areas and movements are connected by a relatively small set of actors who are organizing with each other and so our job is to out-organize them and to challenge that power. So so I think in some ways, like, research can be harder to kind of get through the overwhelm of information, but also I think it has an important and strategic role to play in this moment. And yeah, I think media saturation for us has also been a challenge. Like most people get their news online and generally are overwhelmed, by design, and aren't able to deeply engage with any one thing. And there's also less kind of local media outlets to report on data-driven research that, impacts people's lives every day. So these are some of the challenges that we're seeing. We're also, again, facing a fear around data disappearing under this administration. Already, we see like the Environmental Protection Agency and the CDC, the Center for Disease Control, data being wiped from public access. And there have been, suggestions that campaign finance data, which is like so important to the work that we do and understanding like who's giving money to politicians and understanding the role that super PACs play in influencing elections. There's a fear that some of this, data is also, going to be removed by this administration. So one project that we've been trying to work with other groups on is just actually downloading like all of the FEC database and other sort of databases that are and public information that's really critical for us to be able to do our work, and just figuring out how to house that data offline in case it goes offline and isn't available to the public anymore. So these are some projects that we're working on. We just have also a really like hard line in our work around no AI and not collaborating with organizations. We're seeing the kind of research that we do, the network mapping, and become increasingly like AI generated, and we have been really holding firm that this is like these are tools built by capitalists to serve the capitalists, and they're in fact built to disorganize us and demobilize us, and to kind of overshadow our creativity and spirit in doing kind of the work of liberation that we're doing. So I think these are some strategies that have really kind of emerged in this moment for us that we wouldn't have necessarily named explicitly, but it feels like the moment to name them. And I think, again, just sort of training being such an important part of what we do, trying to find ways to democratize how research and skill sharing happen, continuing to build out a research and training program that can meet the moment and respond to what organizers need to move campaigns forward, and get people more connected to public data sources so that more of us are keeping an eye on the threats to it. And I can stop there.
Great. Yeah, and LittleSis has some great network maps of ICE and its relationship to big tech. So I encourage you all to check it out after the webinar to see some of the work they've been doing. And so maybe we could move on then to Petra. Petra, do you want to share your work?
Sure. Thank you so much, Chris, and thanks to everyone for tuning in today. It's a real pleasure to be here. My name is Petra. I'm a lawyer and an anthropologist by training. But what I want to talk to you about today is a particular project that we incubate at the Refugee Law Lab, which is a research organization at York University that I co-run. It's called the Migration and Technology Monitor. And I want to just reflect a little bit with you about some of the things that have worked for us and some of the things that we have learned that we could be doing better. But essentially, what we try and do is simultaneously illuminate how technologies at the border and different types of projects used for migration management are impacting real people, but also what we can do about it. because, as others have already said, technology is increasingly used at the border and in migration, but it's not really just about the tech, right? It's about power differentials, it's about infrastructures, it's about also who gets to talk about these projects and who is seen as an expert. It is about these kind of logics and tendrils of power and privilege that inform what we know about, what we can dream about, and also what we can contest. And I think Jacinta put it really well. You know, it is about the kind of political underpinning behind all of this. A lot of this is not new, but what we have been seeing, of course, in the second Trump administration, but also in the previous Trump administration and in Democratic administrations as well, is that technology goes hand in hand with control. And what better way to control populations than designate certain communities as the kind of ultimate other, right? And oftentimes it's people who are on the move. So in order to try and undo some of this, what we've been hoping to do is kind of present a different way of working with colleagues on the move who really hold most of the expertise when it comes to kind of technology and migration. So the Migration Technology Monitor started a few years ago. And honestly, at first, it was going to be a platform and a way to hold some of this work at the intersection of technology and migration. But pretty quickly, we realized that we didn't want to replicate, yet another kind of global North Western institution that holds all the power and holds onto the knowledge. We wanted to do something a little bit different. So 3 years ago, we started a fellowship program for colleagues on the move, and then also colleagues under occupation, who already themselves are doing work across the world at the intersection of migration and technology. And I'll tell you a little bit more in a bit and like how the fellowship actually works. But the whole point is, again, to kind of try and undo those power differentials that are really inherent even in how we think about tech and who can even challenge it. The Migration Tech Monitor has since grown into a community. We've incubated 16 fellows from all over the world, some currently living in occupied Palestine, some who are surviving immigration detention in the United States, former Venezuelan refugees, Syrian refugees, people from South Sudan, and all over the world. We try and create the cohorts in a way so that they are broad and so people can kind of co-learn together. We try and work in as horizontal way as possible, where those of us who manage the project and our colleagues on the move are also involved in the collective decision-making around what goes into the project. That also involves, for example, picking new fellows in the next cohort, deciding what to prioritize, and also how to push the conversation forward. We have a few reports on our website if you want to take a look at that. And we've been able to do a few exciting things in the last little while. But of course, I would be remiss not to talk about the very real impact of the current moment. Doing this type of work, as others have already said, has become increasingly difficult, both personally for our team and for our colleagues on the move and those under occupation, but also as the space generally, with cuts to funding, colleagues being put into immigration detention if they travel to the United States, transnational surveillance of our team, academic censure and social media monitoring for people who work on the liberation of Palestine and other causes, and just shrinking space around resources. But I wanted to highlight two very real examples that are happening currently to two of our colleagues. Our colleague Issa Amro is a Palestinian activist who lives in the occupied city of Hebron. He was just attacked by Israeli settlers 2 days ago. We also have a colleague, Grace Gichanga, who is currently in South Africa. And if you're following the situation there are massive protests going on against migration and people on the move there. So our team is dealing with these upheavals on a daily basis in a very, very personal way. And these are just, some of the direct impacts that I can point to. But again, I think there are also broader issues at play here. Some of the broader political logics that we've already heard about, how certain communities again and again are the kind of testing grounds for technological experimentation, the kind of normalization of apartheid and tech-facilitated genocide, as we saw in Gaza, but also in the plight of other groups, the Uyghur people in Xinjiang, for example, people in Kashmir, Sudan, many other places that are becoming these kind of testing grounds for the militarization of tech that is becoming more and more normal. But there's also something subtle at play here that I also want to point to, and that's the kind of logics of how knowledge is produced about these topics as well, and who actually counts as an expert. This is where the Migration Tech Monitor at least tries to do things a little bit differently through the fellowship program that I mentioned. We position the folks that we work with as the real experts. They are experts in their own right, from their own communities, who have a lot to say and who are already doing really amazing things at the intersection of tech and migration. We have folks who are journalists who are looking at surveillance technologies, for example, of Syrian refugees, or those who are former migrant workers documenting data sharing practices in that space. But we also have people who are looking at technology as a form of liberation and a community force for good. For example, we have a psychologist in Somaliland developing applications for and by refugees on the move in that region. So there is another side to technology that we also try and push towards, and that is the kind of development of projects that are baked within communities, that kind of localized knowledge that does maybe allow us to think a little bit differently about what is possible. We also position our fellows as experts in media. If you want to check out some of the stories they've been working on, they are on our website. But again, I think these kind of perhaps more subtle ways to try and undo the power hierarchies, even in terms of who gets to speak about border technologies, who's invited to webinars and panels. There's, I think, some subtle work that we as a space and we need to be pushing forward as well. Lastly, I just wanted to mention, as you can imagine, our community has had to operate entirely online, partly because of repressive visa regimes. And, our colleagues can't come to Toronto or Boston or Brussels. But for the first time in 3 years since we've been running this fellowship, we were able to meet in Nairobi, Kenya last November. We got 13 out of 16 fellows there, as well as some friends and colleagues who were able to join us. And it was really a transformational 3 days. And the fellows decided to put together a manifesto for the broader community on technology, migration, and justice. I would urge you to take a look at it. It's a live document, actually. We have a static PDF, but also a live, commentable kind of online platform that people can engage with as a way to kind of push the conversation further in terms of what do colleagues on the move themselves actually want when it comes to technology and migration. But I think what I want to leave us with is we are really lucky at the Monitor and at the Refugee Law Lab because we get to work internationally on these issues and try and stitch together all these diverse parts of the experience together. And I think this is maybe where there is a little bit of hope that I want to leave us with, that there are already transnational networks of solidarity between disparate communities, communities on the move, communities under occupation, and really anyone who's at the sharpest edges of technological innovation. I think the kind of siloing of lived experience of communities is precisely what, the status quo and the powers that be want us to feel. They want us to feel alone and kind of to turn inward. But actually, I think we should be turning more towards one another and find ways of collaboration so that we can contest this kind of seeming inevitability of tech, which is actually not that inevitable at all. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Petra. And thanks to all the speakers. So folks in the audience, now it's over to you. We would like to hear from you in the Q&A tab. You can just pop your questions in the Q&A or the chat tab. And then Chris and Elena are going to take over kind of facilitating the Q&A. So if you have any questions for any of our speakers, just let us know. Maybe I'll start us off with a question until some folks pop some questions into the Q&A. Data brokers came up in multiple talks, and I know in lots of your work you've touched on data brokers. And at least in Canada, I find a lot of folks don't even know what data brokers are, which is really concerning given the kind of grasp over our personal data that they have and the influence that they can wield. So could you say a little bit about what you've discovered about what data brokers are doing, from landlords to ICE to corporate surveillance to border surveillance?
Feels like a funny, let's see who. I was like, I don't know if I have the most expertise on data brokers, but I'm happy to kick off the combo. Um, I think that when I was talking about like this experience of like starting to note that the way that ICE agents were changing, I had no that date like understanding who a data broker was or how it like how that economy worked was something that I did not know. Um, one of the there's people make fun of me a lot because I've been talking about this for a long time. But like one of the first things that I remember talking about was like data's the new oil, and like the economy is sort of like shifting in terms of like the value of data and like understanding this. You know, when I understood for like from the ICE perspective, like this was the first place where they were trying to go around one, sanctuary protections, but around the Constitution, right? Like the whole idea that they, as ICE agents, as a policing agency, would need to have a warrant to get sensitive information on you is thrown out the window with the existence of data brokers. The thing that I think is just really interesting about understanding data brokers as like a general economy is like there's lots of small data brokers, but there's actually a pretty big duopoly in terms of the major data brokers. And so when folks find out that Relics or Thomson Reuters are such big data brokers, they're like, wait a minute, there's sort of this moment of like, wait, the same legal research tools that I use to figure out my defense of my client is the same way that ICE found out the address of my client to begin with, right? And understanding how those things are connected. I think it's just something really important. Companies like Palantir love to say like, we don't create the data, right? That's somebody else. And so also understanding how they're trying to pass off, they would call it liability. I think it's really accountability for their actions in terms of like, well, we're just capturing information and selling it off and understanding that. But ICE explicitly says that they need contracts with data brokers to get around sanctuary protections. And so to me, that is just very indicative of like they need to be finding these loopholes to be able to conduct it. And that's what they're basing everything on. So when companies like Palantir will say, we're actually creating more privacy for people and like more Fourth Amendment protections for folks, it's completely BS is the most sophisticated way of saying it. Because when you actually look at how they're using the data brokers, it is actually the way that they're able to be able to surveil and track people. And so it is really hard when you're talking to folks around like protection, because many times folks have to choose between basic essentials and knowing that their data is going to be then sold, through the chain back to ICE. And so we've noticed that electric companies, phone companies, insurance companies, they're all sharing this information. And so then ICE and other policing agencies have access to it. And so that's how companies like Palantir can create programs specifically made to what's the likelihood of you being at your address. The way that they're getting that information is through private corporate data brokers. And so it just also goes to connecting some of the dots between, for example, credit scores, right? And the role that companies like Equifax have had to ensure that this data can be sold, to create credit scores on folks. But now we're also understanding the criminalization machinery and the state using this also to further criminalize folks. And so these like confidence scores, targeting scores, all of this vocabulary that they use is actually around how big your files are. So one thing we've done, for example, here in Cook County, we've been trying to get the county to close the data loopholes and the sanctuary provisions and the detainer ordinances that exist. And we've had folks actually go and get their files from data brokers. And honestly, it's one of the most transformative experiences because we think that data brokers are just helping make sure we have more targeted ads. And like, I don't want ads about stuff I'm not interested in anyway, so this will be helpful to me. But actually understanding like what is in your file and understanding like your family members, your social networks, your addresses, how that is all being accumulated in private hands and can be used by the police without any sort of oversight or protection is pretty terrifying. And so like there's a lot more space for us to go in and not just be talking about the role of data brokers in immigration enforcement, but actually in buying and selling information on all of us and the risk that that poses to all of us.
Just want to say, I thought that was a really great answer to the question of what data brokers do and the real impacts of that.
Yeah, thank you so much.
I wanted to mention just also in our book, there's a group called the Workers' Algorithm Observatory that we talk about how people like Jacinta mentioned, people on the ground can get access to their own data. So what they have been doing has been getting access to the data that for Uber drivers, right? Uber drivers wanting to know how much is being kind of taken by Uber for their rides and things like that. Working with the drivers, the Workers' Algorithm Observatory has been able to get access to that data and share it with the drivers themselves. And that's a way of kind of building counterpower from below through actively kind of using data brokers on the other side. So it's kind of interesting how can be flipped sometimes.
We have some questions in the chat, and I'm going to open up the chat here. I think you can probably see it on your side too. The first question is from Martin French, and it says, Munira, in your talk, you mentioned research is not enough. And I think this is in the context of the Trump administration's total disregard for things like truth. Can I ask you to say more about organizing strategies in this context where we need to mobilize through research, but also beyond research? And if any other panelists would like to weigh in on this too.
Yeah, I think to that I would say, like, I mean, I think the Trump administration has like a kind of blatant disregard for facts and is really, wants to sort of contest the terrain of truth. But I also think this is, a challenge that's existed before this administration. I think there, is a larger sort of question of the role that research plays in furthering kind of in furthering campaigns. And I think for us, research without, I think publishing research is really important. And sometimes research can be sort of ahead of the organizing in some ways. It's a way of reporting and again, sort of highlighting important trends that we see that are happening in kind of capital and in finance that we want to kind of flag. So again, 10, 15 years ago, the rise of sort of big tech and the way that they were sort of posturing to become the next fossil fuel and oil and gas kind of industry to have the same kind of influence that they did. So that kind of, I think, research and reporting that's like helping us understand like the terrain in which we're fighting in is really important for organizers. And I think to the point of, how much does that actually like influence decision makers? We know the impacts, for instance, of things like fracking on and on like fossil fuel infrastructure and the impacts that has on like frontline communities that infrastructure is built in, the rates of cancer, the rates of kind of ailments that people experience, and yet it has not done nearly enough to force the hand of politicians or decision makers to do anything differently. So I think for us as movements to really think about not just like convincing, using kind of research to convince decision makers, but actually to force decision makers or to force maybe the kind of network of power behind these decisions and to create a kind of crisis for them, right? And so that's, I think, often what we're thinking about is how do we, go look beyond just sort of, if we have all of the facts and we have all of the information, we can kind of affect change and make a difference. But to really think about research as something that we can use to create a crisis for the capitalist class, and oftentimes that's, campaigns that really go after, in the realm of like the climate justice movement, like are really going after the insurers of some of these infrastructure projects to make it so that it's just like gonna affect their bottom line and going to cause them to pull out of sort of insuring projects. And by doing this, I think, just really, I think using research to kind of empower people to think beyond just the how do we, get the right person elected who's going to do what we want, but how do we actually go after the people who are, who stand to profit from this and who we can kind of impact in other ways. I'm not sure if I totally got to that question. I really want to hear if other people have thoughts on this too.
Petra or Jacinta, did you want to reflect further?
Yeah, I mean, what I would just to piggyback on what you were sharing, Munira, like I think to me it's also like how research happens and what it's anchored in really, really makes a difference. I think that's why it's been like organizations like LittleSis, like for us, when as mi gente, like having the research, we work with a research company, right? Empower that does a lot of the corporate mapping. But they're working directly with the organizers in terms of developing the questions, mapping out the thing, figuring out like what's the story we want to tell. So I do think that if those conversations are sort of had in vacuums and we sort of think that there's this premise that like if we just tell the truth, then things will dramatically change, like we're kind of ceding a lot of power and a lot of space. And so I do think that when the research is sort of embedded in the organizing, either with organizers asking the questions or organizers involved in telling like what's the power arc, right? Like how are we trying to build power to get to this place? Like a lot of this research, like uncovering how evil Palantir is, like it's both, it can help illustrate it, but it also is actually makes it more daunting, right? Like it's kind of like, how in the hell are we going to build enough power against a company that has all of this influence, all of this money, all of these like like very horrifying ties in terms of like global power and dominance. But it's actually through actions and through the organizing that we can like kind of play with that, right? So when we first put out the Who's Behind ICE report, the picture on the cover was of a huge cage that we took to Burning Man, right? And it was, we were having fun with it, but we were also just giving flyers out to everybody at Burning Man, being like, you see these tech bros? They're actually the ones working with ICE. And so the story was both of the action, but also the research that sort of supported it. And so to me, those are the examples where you can like have some really beautiful receipts, which lets you be able to publicly say the things that you can say because they are companies that are so litigious. Like you need to actually make sure that your research is going to withhold the level of backlash, right, that you're going to have as you organize. But if you don't have the organizing, it just kind of stays on the shelf. Like you do have to create like that friction for them, that tension, building up that power, making them have to like hold them to account for it. And so I think that's where it's making sure that it's connected to organizing and just not in academic institutions has felt really important. I think it's like you can have that connection, but making sure that is there is critical to being able to like actually make a difference in what we're trying to confront.
Petra, did you want to weigh in? Okay, yeah. I also just wanted to mention Erin unfortunately had to leave. They had a class that they had to teach right after this. So, but We do have another question that it was, I think, more directed to Erin, but I think it could be directed to everyone. And if you guys have questions in the attendees, you can ask it in the Q&A. If you don't see it at the bottom of the screen, it might be in the little three dots. If you click on that, you can click on the Q&A box and you can ask questions through that kind of portal. So Alessandra says, "Hi all, thank you for all your amazing work. This is a question for all. Given the huge overlaps between tech companies and data brokers working on weapons, surveillance, and civilian tech like prop tech, can you see ways to consolidate efforts through databases and resource sharing? One of the big problems, as Erin mentioned, is the lack of data we can find on housing, but some of the data may be available from researchers and activists looking at other issues." So a question in terms of resource sharing, coordinating kind of work across different areas.
Maybe I can jump in just briefly. This is something we run into quite a lot working at the international level, where trying to follow the money of a particular corporation becomes perhaps even more difficult, or I should say differently difficult than looking at these issues domestically, because you're then also dealing with, intersecting jurisdictions, different types of corporate shielding. It just muddies the waters even more. And, it's something we commiserate a lot about with other researchers and journalists and other affected community groups. It's a kind of an ecosystem-wide problem. What helps is, I think, being very transparent about what we don't know, and what some of the gaps in knowledge really are. But also, precisely, I think what you get at in your question there, like how can we creatively find ways to help each other? And one way that we've, for example, done it at the Refugee Law Lab is by partnering with groups on the other side of the border. We often work with the Border Chronicle in Arizona, for example, and sometimes we're able to share access to information requests or freedom of information requests with each other, kind of transnationally, to try and get at the same type of question from two different jurisdictions. We've done something similar in the European Union and other jurisdictions too. It doesn't always work, but you'd be surprised what you can find, because sometimes, governments have different rules around disclosure when it comes to procurement notices or companies that are involved, for example, or how much money is changing hands. I mean, it's not a foolproof method at all. And I think what your question actually gets at is for us to not just think in terms of like two border researchers working together, but rather, a border migration researcher working with somebody thinking about housing or healthcare or criminal justice issues. I do think there's still a little bit of kind of like siloing that goes on, and we need to creatively think about how we can help each other to try and, uncover as many of these gray areas as possible in this deliberately opaque space. Because, of course, none of this is accidental. I mean, I think it's very obvious that the powers that be make it very difficult for us to have a clear understanding of what the full picture actually is.
I was going to ask Chris, do you have any questions for any of the panelists? Because I know you usually write down a couple of good questions during a talk.
Just something that came to mind hearing Petra talk was just like about archiving and the importance of building archives that can be shared between different groups, right? I was thinking that connects also to what Munira is talking about with LittleSis, where there's a database where maybe if you're looking at networks, you can see how the same actors can be involved in different issues that connect in different ways, right? So I was wondering about archiving and how you guys are working to archive data in different ways, what challenges you're facing with archiving the data, but also sharing the archives and sharing that data with other people, I think can be quite challenging. So, and getting it out there. So I was wondering if anybody wanted to talk about that.
Yeah, I was going to say, aggregating this kind of data is sort of our mission, and in the hopes that it can serve a kind of multi kind of movement, and help kind of make those connections between different issues and common actors. And so that the database is really like designed for that. And in terms of archiving, I mean, in some ways it's like just by the sheer fact that LittleSis.org has existed since 2008, it's kind of it's a kind of archive of from the 2008 financial crisis to now, sort of the role of and I think being like in the database pretty regularly, seeing the different kind of waves of research that have come in over the years, and you know and the different crises kind of represented through some of the editing that's happening in the database has, I think, been really illuminating. And when the database first started, it was really US focused, and really focused on kind of Wall Street and finance and the fossil fuel industry. As time goes on, there's more data from around the world, and there's a kind of just more of a kind of breadth of the kinds of kind of companies, and obviously an explosion of kind of research that's being done on like the tech sector and on policing and militarization. And so there's a way that actually, as a LittleSis user, you can see everyone else's edits. So it's like if you log in and take a look and see what people are adding to the database, it kind of gives you a little bit of a snapshot of what kind of campaigns or things people are sort of interested in researching in this moment. So I kind of, I feel like there's with it being a kind of open source wiki style tool, it gives you a glimpse into some of the organizing that's happening kind of around the country. And then just to speak to the kind of archiving question too, it's like we in the last few years made it so that like all of the links that are added by users into the database are archived with the I'm going to forget the name, the Wayback Machine, the Internet Archive, because we were also worried about, again, the disappearance of information. And we actually did this. We instituted this in 2020 when we were doing research on police foundations. And we were just going straight to these police foundation websites and pulling all of the names of the corporate sponsors. And the first article that we published on it, immediately afterward, a bunch of these police foundations removed their corporate sponsorship page. And so we were like, oh, we really wish we had archived all of those. And in some cases we did, and others we didn't. But like being able to kind of archive our sources is really important, as we're seeing kind of, again, just corporations really quickly kind of taking down information that they deem a threat or, a risk for them.
Maybe another question, kind of $1 million question. Artificial intelligence. How do you see that changing your work over the next, let's say, 5 years? How is it going to impact the work that you're doing?
As we're preparing the second version of the report, we really sort of thought about what is going on at DHS as like a big dumpster fire, and AI is like taking a can of gasoline and just throwing it on top just to see what'll happen. That's sort of, I think, what we're seeing in terms of what's happening when you think about DHS surveillance and tech machinery against, anyone who's part of any sort of resistance and anyone who is an immigrant in this country. I think AI is both fueling so much of the surveillance tech, is fueling so much of the big tech oligarchs, in terms of like what they're trying to do in terms of their positioning. And, I think it's really, really important for us. I was talking about, doing a lot of this work as Mi Gente and now organizing at MediaJustice around data centers. We're seeing that this huge build out of data centers, of machinery is really to be able to project all of this growth around AI, but it's also really to connect around surveillance, right? So part of what for us has been important is like, as horrible as these chatbots are, right? Like I'm very happy to talk about the utter bullshit that comes out of Grok or ChatGPT in terms of like the types of responses that they're giving. But equally dangerously is actually the fact that they all want to have, drones that they're initially designing for warfare, but then bringing back as first responders for police or putting them in the hands of Border Patrol, right? To be able to surveil all of us. So I think making sure that folks are both like understanding the dangers of the conversation around AI, but also like the dangers that it possesses, particularly when we're thinking about surveillance, but how this is also part of the acceleration of the resource grab, right, that the oligarchs are doing, but also the like we think about sometimes the financial resources, but they're literally making grabs for our land, for our water, for our air right now. And so really understanding not only how they're exasperating energy use and all of this in terms of trying to build up data centers, but also how it connects locally to our local democracies, but also how we protect our communities from surveillance are all linked. And so I think that it's really important to be able to talk about and like connect all of those dots for folks as we're talking about these things. And I think something that to me continues to be a place where we need to think more is also, as we're thinking about this AI bubble, as we're thinking about how they're investing billions, if not trillions of dollars into their vision of the world, how are we fighting back and talking about a different vision of how we can take care of our planet, can take care of communities and not sort of prioritize just an investment in AI.
That was so beautifully said. I just wanted to add, in addition to the many grabs that you mentioned, there's also this kind of grab on our imagination, right? And how we, again, like how we create knowledge, what we consume, what we can even imagine as an alternative for a different world. I mean, if you look at the kind of even changes recently, right, in social media and in increasingly short form content, it just seems like nobody wants to, consume anything long form, complex, like something that really sits with the kind of, the complexity of being a human in the world, right? We all want these like bite-sized pieces. And that even goes to like information that we can put out, right? Here we are like writing reports or books and stuff. I mean, people want a 90-second reel or even 30 seconds. I don't even know, right? Like it just is changing everything, even in terms of how we can talk to one another or relate to one another. And so that I think actually scares me quite a lot, as someone who thinks and educates and shares ideas and gets to like, be in conversation with really complex humans around the world. We seem to be moving away from complexity rather than embracing it as the kind of vital element of the human condition.
I think the last thing I'll add is just, to us, like research, the process is just as important as the output, right? As the product. And so, and without being engaged in the process, you actually can't teach another person to do that research too. Like you can't sort of pass on that experiential knowledge. And so the process of doing research is really important. It's part of organizing. It's a muscle that we build, and it's a way that we think creatively, and everyone does it differently. There's no formula for it. And so for us, it's, as I said, it's kind of a hard no because so it's so critical to our work to be able to engage in the process of research with others. So I think that's that's what I'm thinking about it.
Great, thanks. Yeah, I like how you brought it back to community and community building through data. Right, because you were talking about the challenge of media saturation before, which I think also connects with Petra's point, like just how do we get our message out there now? When if you want to send a message about the things that you're organizing around, are you finding that the strategies that you're engaging in are changing now as a way of kind of doing that? And you know, uh, I've noticed with all of you, we were talking about both the importance of kind of digital forms of connection, but also the analog, right? And the importance of these in-person events. So just wondering, as a final thought, just in terms of strategies going forward, what do you think needs to be done? And, how do you envision your work kind of going forward?
Maybe just briefly, and maybe as an antidote to this kind of like bite-sizification of information, I will continue writing books. I don't know who will keep reading them, but I will continue, and I hope you do too. But jokes aside, yeah, I think it's about finding like creative ways to collaborate both in the digital realm, but also in the physical realm across different disciplines and lived experience, and to keep challenging each other, to also work beyond the kind of silos that we often find ourselves in. Because, yeah, I mean, researchers can learn so much from organizers and artists and poets and dreamers, right? I think there's so many ways that we can work together to try and push for a different world, but we can't kind of, lose sight of the fact that, yeah, we're all really fighting the same fight in all of it.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think more books for sure, more in-person meetings, more working with community. I think more getting to know your neighbors, more knowing who your city council person is, more knowing if a data center is coming to town, who are your 5 people that you're calling up for that night meeting to be able to make the noise that is needed. When an ICE agent is coming to take your neighbor, who are the 5 people you're calling to be able to respond? Like, at the end of the day, it is actually as it's like you can call it basic or you can call it like actually that easy, right? Like it is actually about building relationships with each other. It's actually about building organizing networks. I always tell people like if there was one solution to these things, it would have been fixed a long time ago. And so like that does mean like if your jam is electoral politics and you want to go door knock before the next election, please, we need you. If you're going to create a beautiful poster that we can use to create art to like smother our town in something much more beautiful than these tech bros' vision of the world, please like come in. If your thing is like writing really detailed research reports, we need all of the footnotes next time we're going to talk in front of city council, right? So like all of these things are really so connected. And I think part of our role is being able to both create a very clear narrative of like what are we fighting against, what are we up against, but also creating the opportunities for folks to come together and have that little taste of victory, right? Whether it's a local contract that you're able to shut down or actually just able to help a family in their times of most need, or it's actually about creating like a space to vision what do we want our cities to look like in the next 20 years. All of those are spaces where we can kind of plug in and build with each other, and that's where that's where we have to go. At the end of the day, like the tech oligarchs are making these moves, and they're actually very big moves. And part of the reason that they need that level of money, that level of control, that level of destructive power is because they know that when regular people come together and are like, we don't want this, that's going to be actually how it's going to happen. And so I think for us, it's how do we fight against this narrative of inevitability, that they are going to control what's going to happen, that they control the tech, that they control the vision. It's really about pushing against that. And the only way we do that is in relationship with one another.
Yeah, again, so beautifully said by both of you. Yeah, I think really challenging the inevitability narrative, that there's only one direction for history to go in when we know that, we know that's not the case. And we know that that's happening, in fact, all around us all the time. And just like uplifting those stories, like you said, like you both said. So
That might be a good way to end on a high note and focusing on the hopefulness of it. And I think it really comes out really well in all of your presentations. Just like your work is so inspiring and it's so hopeful and empowering, and we really appreciate that you took the time to share your stories with us and contribute to the book. So thanks so much for being a part of it. And yeah, Petra, Munira, Jacinta, and Erin, who's no longer on the webinar, but thanks to all of you. It was really great. And thanks to everyone for participating. Thanks for coming. As I mentioned before, we have a discount code for the book, so please just send us an email. If you want 25% off the book, just let us know. I see some great comments from you all in the chat, and a lot of inspired people. So thanks everyone, and yeah, we'll keep in touch.